Hello, Buckeye fans. Welcome to another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. I am Patrick Murphy, and we are here in an early off week, which we will talk about later on during the show. It's an off week, and last week, former Ohio State wide receiver DeVier Posey gave me some shtick about drinking a seltzer on this during the happy hour. So I went old school. We're going to drink Natural Light, which was something I became rather familiar with during my college years. I may have a birthday celebration with some friends later, not my birthday. And so I bought some Natural Light to throw things back a little bit. So we're going to have one of these on the podcast today and see if I can only drink one, because that was a problem in college, I'm going to be honest. We're going to start this podcast for the first part of the show with no Ohio State game to talk about, looking at the team up north and Michigan and what has gone on for the defending national champions early in this season. And to do so, we're bringing on Alejandro Zuniga from the Michigan Insider. Alejandro, how is it going up there?
Not too bad. Not too bad. I was actually torn between bringing a seltzer and my current beverage, which is a Fat Squirrel from New Glarus. Nice. So given the heat you got last week, I'm glad I went for my brew as opposed to, a fruity beverage.
Yeah. Not only did DeVier Posey call me out on it at the end of his segment on this show, but then I was on a radio segment where he was co-hosting, and he asked me if I found any real beer yet. So he's called me out twice in a week. So I felt like
so does Natty Light count as real beer? Because that's I feel like that's a debate too.
I guess that's valid. I will have to check with DeVier. It was certainly real beer in college because it was what we could get. What did you drink as a young, I assume, not financially well-off college student who needed to get their hands on cheap beer?
Yeah, correct on all counts. A bit of everything. I'd say our go-to cheap beers were usually Coors Light or Rolling Rock. One of the two. I actually had the great fortune last year when Michigan played at Penn State. The closest hotel we could find that was reasonable was in Latrobe, Pennsylvania.
Sure.
Which I learned is both the home of Rolling Rock and Arnold Palmer. So that was a very good throwback for me on a very eventful November afternoon.
Yeah. That was the no passes in the second half, right? That game.
That was indeed, yes.
Yep. And as we get going here, Kevin points out that you are looking very Ohio State-ish today. I think that's a soccer jersey, though. No?
It is. Yeah, it is Costa Rica's Independence Day in a couple days. It's on the 15th, along with most of the rest of Central America. So I figured I'd rep the homeland with a old school, at this point, it's like 2012-ish Costa Rica soccer jersey.
Very nice. All right. Well, let's get into it, because I don't think people care that much about our love of soccer. Maybe they care a little bit about our beer stories. Michigan, 1-1 on the season. Sure. Opened the season with a 30-10 win against Fresno State. And then I think pretty much everyone watched last week against Texas. But I want to go back to the offseason. Michigan's coming off a national championship. And obviously, you'll see in the comments, there will be a lot of talk about everything that happened. And I'll ask you about Connor Stalions a little bit later, but let's just focus on the field stuff. Michigan wins a national championship. How did that change Michigan's offseason? Because I remember when Ohio State won in 2014, there was just a lot more going on from a media perspective. Even before NIL, there were obligations of guys going on shows and people coming into the facility. Did you notice as much? Did you notice differences this offseason with the Wolverines?
I mean, it was another crazy offseason, and I feel like we had this exact same conversation at about this exact same time of the year last year. I think a couple of different things that the national championship created. Number one is that it condensed the offseason, right? It meant that Michigan played later than any other team except for Washington. Meant that the offseason was that much shorter. And then it also, I think, led to a lot of people who had the opportunity to leave and pursue their NFL dreams to go ahead and do that, because they'd already accomplished what they wanted to accomplish at this level. Jim Harbaugh being one of them, right? But if you're thinking about a JJ McCarthy who maybe was on the fence a little bit, if you're thinking about, really anyone on the roster who had the opportunity to go and maybe got the feedback they wanted from the NFL, they took that opportunity, and that's where you saw Michigan have an excellent draft class, record setting for the program, and record setting number of people at the NFL Combine. But that combined with a shortened off season, combined with them pursuing a college football playoff at a time when the winter transfer portal was opening and then closing, and then losing a head coach. It's just like, we've had this conversation a lot, is that Jim Harbaugh's dalliances with the NFL made it so that even as Michigan was winning 3 straight Big Ten championships, it was never fully reaping the momentum from that. And I feel like this offseason, with a shortened offseason, with the coaching turnover and with the roster turnover, led to sort of a similar feel as in previous years, despite a national championship being won.
Was there any doubt in your mind that Chiron Moore was going to be the guy when Jim Harbaugh left?
Not really. As we learned afterward, Jim Harbaugh had actually approached Ward Manuel about naming Chiron Moore coach in waiting. If, something were to happen, and obviously something happened, but so those conversations had already been had. It was pretty clear that there was internal program momentum, that the guy who led Michigan to, the win over Ohio State, obviously the win over Penn State that we just talked about. And, he'd also, there's the Maryland game. There was the one of the first 3 games when Harbaugh had been suspended for a different issue. Chiron had been in the program for 6 years. So I think there was a lot of momentum, and he was kind of the reasonable choice. I wonder if, in a couple of years' time, depending on how things play out, if there will be some doubts as to, hey, maybe we could have done a more national search, we could have considered more options. But I think given the time in which it happened and the circumstances, Chiron Moore was the right choice and the reasonable choice as well.
Did much change with Chiron taking over, or did he keep things a lot like Jim Harbaugh did things, across the board?
Yeah, pretty similar. I think, listen, it's Chiron Moore's first head coaching gig, right? So, and he's spent the last 6 years under Jim Harbaugh as kind of a Jim Harbaugh disciple. So it's a lot, covering a Chiron Moore program is a lot like covering a Jim Harbaugh program, just maybe a little bit more boring in press conferences. Because, Jim Harbaugh, even though he didn't like to say much of anything, would often have an anecdote or two that would kind of, perk your ears or make you really, chuckle inside. You don't get quite so much of that with Chiron Moore, but again, he's a first-year head coach. But right. I mean, really, I think Joel Klatt said this at one point in his podcast. It's like Michigan changed, more than half of its coaching staff. It turned over so much of its program from a player perspective, but they spent the whole offseason insisting that nothing had changed from a culture perspective. So whether or not that's true, I mean, it's probably too early to say one way or the other, but the hope was that Michigan would continue on its same, cultural identity, football playing style as it had the last few years under Jim Harbaugh.
Just real quick, Rob Schaller says, Natty Light, why not lick the toilet bowl while you're at it? Well, Rob, there have been nights of too many Natty Lights where I felt like that was what was going to happen. Not in a long time, but back in the day.
And hopefully not tonight.
No, definitely not tonight. I intend to enjoy the bye week. The quarterback situation has obviously been a topic, and we'll get to the play on the field. But for those in Columbus, Buckeye fans who didn't pay attention, kind of how did it play out to get to where we ended up at the start of the season with Davis Warren winning the job, and, kind of take us through what happened in the offseason with the quarterback after JJ McCarthy left.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is really the story of a couple of years. And this is where, maybe Jim Harbaugh's, unwillingness to fully commit to Michigan plays a role, right? Sure. Because Michigan went a few years or a couple of years where they didn't really land an upper echelon quarterback recruit. Davis Warren, he's technically a walk-on. Obviously, I'm sure if you watched, Big Noon or Game Day, I'm sure they touched on this, his background with cancer, and ended up being a walk-on, but, maybe probably would have been like a 4-star ish or a high 3-star had the cancer not derailed his, high school career. But the reality is that like in 2022, Michigan recruited a couple of 3-stars in Alex Orji and Jaden Donegal. In 23, their quarterback recruit was Kendrick Bell, who very quickly arrived on campus and switched to wide receiver. So like this has been a problem maybe a couple years in the making, where you'd expect a program of Michigan's caliber to be landing a viable college quarterback pretty much every year. And that both wasn't the case. And then Michigan also didn't maybe do what people thought they might do or what they could have done in pursuing someone in the transfer portal. Again, that's a complicated conversation.
Sure.
Because at the time that the winter transfer portal was open, Michigan was still pursuing a national championship last year, and they weren't 100% sure if JJ McCarthy might come back or not. And then by the time the spring portal opened and Jim Harbaugh was gone, JJ McCarthy was gone, there just weren't as many viable options at that point in the portal window. So that's how you end up with a quarterback competition that really came down to Jack Tuttle, who started at Indiana, or he didn't start at Indiana. He started a couple games at Indiana, but had been at Indiana for a while, has been at Michigan for a couple of years. Alex Orji, who Ohio State fans will remember from last year, and Davis Warren. And Jack Tuttle had been hurt. He had an elbow issue throughout the offseason that still is limiting him in some capacity. So really the quarterback battle came down to two people. It was Davis Warren and Alex Orji. And we as media members don't get a chance to see practice. So we only hear really what those who are watching practice tell us, whether that's coaches or others. And I'll say for the last 3 years, practice reports have generally played out to be true, right? When people were saying that, Mike Morris is coming on as a really good edge rusher, or JJ McCarthy is really lighting it up and taking over, stepping beyond Cade McNamara, like those things ended up being true. What we were hearing about Alex Orji and Davis Warren in practice at least hasn't played out in games to that level.
The last preseason question I have for you is, my expectation was that this defense would still be close to the level it was last year, given the guys coming back. Obviously not everyone back. What did you think about the defense coming into the season? And we'll get to how it's played out, but what were your expectations for that side of the ball?
Yeah, I think my expectations, at least from a first 11, like a starting 11, would be similar. I kind of thought that Michigan's starting 11 would go toe-to-toe with anyone in the country. They should, and I believe do have that top-level talent. Michigan's secret, especially last year, was in their depth, right? And that's where I felt that this year there was less proven depth. When Michigan was winning a national championship last year, Keon Sabb, who was, a fourth string or a fifth or sixth option at the beginning of the year, he was playing a majority of snaps against Washington and playing like a starter and playing at that upper echelon. Ended up transferring to Alabama this offseason. He's starting there and playing very well from everything I've seen. But Michigan, in the safety room, right? Like Rod Moore got hurt. He tore his ACL in the spring. So that removed kind of some depth in the secondary. Michigan at its defensive tackle had a rotation going last year in the edge room. They had a 4-person rotation. They lost some of those guys to the NFL, and the backups are, talented, but they're not at that same level. Where when we came into this year, I thought if Michigan is playing, 80 defensive snaps like they actually ended up doing against Texas a week ago, that's where it could present issues because you have unproven guys behind them. But my expectations, again, coming into this year with keeping a similar scheme under Wink Martindale, as Michigan had employed with Jesse Minter, Mike McDonald, with having some of those same guys who started a national championship run, really thought that the peak, your ones would be as strong as anyone in the country.
All right, let's get into the season. Fresno State week 1. It was a bit of a struggle. We'll get to watch all this game live. I kind of tuned in towards the end, kind of saw Michigan seal the deal. Ohio State had some issues week 1, too, ends up pulling away as well. I think a lot of teams in the country, you see that with no preseason. But what was your impression coming out of that game, obviously with an eye on what was the big game in week 2?
Yeah, I think it's tough. Week 1 is always tough. And overreaction to week 1 is, I think a fallacy that we all fall into, even when we tell ourselves we're not going to. So I think week 1, you probably have to look back at it in a couple weeks to really have more context onto, what that game really meant. But you think with Fresno State, like Fresno State's a solid G5 team, right? They have been for a long time. The one thing that I think fans across the country undervalue is the value of a returning starting quarterback. And that's something that Fresno State had. And obviously it's something that Texas had too. So, when you have a returning starter, it's tougher to confuse them. They are usually more poised in the pocket. They've seen these things before. I don't think there were really many defensive issues against Fresno State. Certainly nothing that really jumped out as super, super alarming. Will Johnson got beat on a double move, didn't end up costing him, but it's something we didn't really see last year. But like Will Johnson has put together the body of evidence that you'd expect that not to persist. And it didn't against Texas, to be clear. I think the issues were more on the offensive side of the ball, where, as I'm sure we'll talk about, there were a couple of starters on the offensive line who, coming into fall camp, people didn't expect them to be competing for starting jobs. At the center position, at the right tackle position, there are players starting who were not expected to maybe even crack the 2 deep before fall camp started. And, that led to, a stop and start game offensively against Fresno State, where the offense never got into a rhythm. They, until the fourth quarter, weren't really able to piece together a long methodical drive, the kind that you expect from Michigan. They had a pick 6 late that made the score look better than it was, but it was a 6-point game in the fourth quarter, which certainly isn't where anyone wanted to be with Texas coming up a week later.
While you are talking, and first, if you're watching this live, I forgot to mention off the top, if you have questions for me about the Buckeyes, for Alejandro about Michigan, I saw a couple in this live chat already. Feel free and throw those in there. Try and keep them, appropriate if they're for Alejandro. If they're for me, you can say whatever you want. But feel free to throw some questions in there if you want. I will have time at the end to talk some Buckeyes, some college football. So if you have some questions, throw those in. But Alejandro, you mentioned the offensive line. Obviously, that was Chiron Moore's position group, right? A year ago. How much has his move to head coach and his replacement, how much has that changed things? How do you kind of judge that group here, taking into account it's still early on?
Yeah, again, it's early. So jury's still out, but the expectation, the person who took over at offensive line was Grant Newsome, who by all accounts is just a rising star in the profession. Like, I have rarely heard as much positive praise for a coach, like universal positive praise, as we've heard for Grant Newsome. He's the sort of guy that, Jim Harbaugh talked about could be, a future president type thing. And again, what I'd say with the offensive line is, if you remember the NFL Combine or the NFL Draft, like Michigan lost its top 6 offensive linemen from last year. So there were, of course, going to be growing pains with whatever group of 5 they decided to roll out on the offensive line. But what we ended up seeing, and what we've gotten through the first 2 games at Michigan, is the starting center is a man named Dom Jadis. He was a defensive lineman coming out of high school. He's flipped, he kind of played both offensive and defensive line through the first couple of years. He was not expected to win the center job, right? He wasn't really expected to even factor heavily in it. Michigan had 2 players who have been with the program for a few years, one in Greg Crippen, who started at center at IMG, and who Michigan coaches have said they've been comfortable playing him. Like, they would have been comfortable starting him last year. They would have been comfortable starting him the year before. It just so happened that they got really excellent centers out of the transfer portal each of the last 2 years. So people expected maybe Greg Crippen would win the job, maybe Raheem Anderson, who also played center in high school and has been with the program for a couple of years. Neither of them did. So it's Dom Jadis, and he has not looked fantastic through the first couple of games. Again, maybe not that surprising given his background and how recently he switched to center, but that's what Michigan got. And then at right tackle, there were, again, a couple players, including one in Jeff Percy, who has started a game at Michigan before, has been in the program for a while. Andrew Gentry, who's an older, I believe he's a sophomore at this point, but went on a Mormon mission. So he's an older guy, and was a highly touted recruit. Like those two were supposed to be the guys competing for the job. And then the week of fall camp, we start hearing Evan Link's name, who's a redshirt freshman, has not played for Michigan before. And he's the guy who ends up winning the job. And he really had a rough go of it against Texas. So listen, when you have Chiron Moore, who led an offensive line to 2 Joe Moore awards when he was the offensive line coach, when you have a coach in Grant Newsome who played offensive line at Michigan, played under Jim Harbaugh, has been with the program for a while, and who everyone just absolutely loves and thinks is a fantastic coach, you do have some trust in that group can get better. But then when you have 2 really early surprises and weaknesses on the offensive line, it raises question marks as to why those guys won the job and, what happened elsewhere.
As we kind of get into the Texas game, we've talked about Warren a little bit. Obviously, Orji has also come in for some plays. How do you like, or how do you dislike, I guess, depending on your perspective, what they're doing with the quarterback situation? And we were asked, I saw this earlier from Young on YouTube, is there any chance that Tuttle turns out to be the guy if and when he's healthy?
Yeah, I'll start with the Tuttle question first. Definitely possible. Tuttle is the most experienced guy in the room. Last year, Tuttle was the primary backup and played well in reserve snaps. The thing I'd say with him is the health is the most important issue with him. He missed some time last year with an arm injury. He got, I think it was a late hit out of bounds, and he ended up hitting the brick and dislocating something. Looked very painful. So there's that, and then obviously he's been out for a good chunk of. He was out in the spring. He's been very limited so far through the summer and into fall camp. So, I think if he were fully healthy and could stay healthy, he'd definitely be a factor. Just given the experience that he has playing college ball, and he knows the offense. He's been with the program for a couple of years, but health is the main concern. And then in terms of, do I like what Michigan's done with the quarterback rotation? Not entirely. The reason I say my concern is that Michigan spent fall camp talking about how there was a very close quarterback battle between Alex Orji and Davis Warren. And if that's the case, then that implies that Alex Orji can successfully throw a football. And we have yet to see that this year, right? Davis Warren has come in for very limited snaps against both Fresno State and Texas, but he's not usually playing more than one play at a time. Against Fresno State, for some reason, Michigan would bring him in only on 2nd and long. And then he would mostly run the ball, and then he'd come out and Davis Warren would come back in. And that just, to me, doesn't seem conducive to getting in a rhythm if you're Davis Warren, or B, for Alex Orji to show what he can do, both as, the athletic package that he is as a running quarterback, but also as someone who could throw the ball. So my hope is that if Michigan wants to expand what it does with Alex Orji, is that against Arkansas State, maybe in the second half, if it's a blowout, you give Alex Orji a full drive or two and let him show what he can do in commanding the offense, because they haven't done that yet. And if the offensive line is going to struggle the way it's struggled in both run blocking and pass protection, having a guy like Alex Orji who can let you play 11 on 11 in the ground game, and is the type of, again, athletic player who can erase mistakes elsewhere, that might be a more viable option down the road.
All right, let's get into the Texas game. If somehow you, as Ohio State fans listening to this, didn't watch that game on Big Noon, it was a 31-12 win for Texas in Ann Arbor. Former Ohio State quarterback Quinn Ewers, obviously a part of that game. You were there, I believe.
Indeed.
What I'm sure most people saw it, so you don't need to recap the game. But coming out of that, what is the mood around Ann Arbor going forward? You have a national championship, but you come out in week 2 and have that kind of performance at home. So where is the fan base right now?
I think the fan base is mostly reminiscing about January 8th and thinking fondly back to January 1st, those couple things. I don't think there's panic or, widespread alarm. I think it's a realization that expectations for this year have to be significantly reset. I'd say across the board, both offense, defense, schematically, outside of the kicker, honestly. Things that for Michigan through the first couple of weeks have mostly come out at the lower end of expectations. Again, mentioned the offensive line with a couple of real problem spots. Like there was always expected, teething issues with replacing 5 starting offensive linemen. But the thought was with the players they had in the wings, the players they'd had in the program for a long time, that it wouldn't look like this. With quarterback, same sort of thing. I think people mostly expected it to be Alex Orji, and people mostly expected Alex Orji to be a competent thrower of the football, somewhat comparable to maybe what Jalen Milroe was last year, right? Similar type things on the defensive side of the ball is where, like, last year there were question marks going into the year with who was going to be CB2, who was going to, with the linebacker room, like all these things, and everything worked out, to the upper level of expectations last year. This year, the transfer linebacker from Maryland is not playing at the All-American level that coaches kind of teased him to be playing at through fall camp, right? Like there are just like these shortfalls that really became evident against the Texas team that is both very good, very talented, but also returned a lot of players and is kind of in its window, like Michigan was last year, of potentially pushing for a national championship.
Do you think that perspective is similar inside the program, or do you think they're viewing it any differently?
I mean, it's hard to say, right? If you're the benefit of a 12-team playoff is you can have a week like Texas. You could have 2, right? Like Michigan plays a very tough schedule this year. Like they host Texas. Obviously, they've got Oregon, USC, Ohio State. Like it's a difficult schedule. So the reality is, like, this team can still achieve its goals. Again, Michigan hasn't suffered Michigan hasn't suffered a regular season loss since 2021. They haven't lost at the Big House since 2020. So it was a bit of a, like a bucket of cold water of like, hey, not only can this happen, but this can happen in a way that is uncompetitive, the way it was against Texas. And I think it's very fortunate for them that there's Arkansas State on the docket this week, because Michigan desperately needs to find offensive consistency. Like they have not gotten into an offensive rhythm at any point this year. There's never been a drive, except for maybe the final one against Fresno State. There has not been a single drive where things just felt easy or things just felt like they clicked. And they absolutely need that this week against Arkansas State, because you have USC coming to town in 2 weeks, and USC looks significantly better defensively and equally dangerous offensively as they did last year.
I was looking at the schedule because you mentioned USC and Oregon. Both those games being at home from a fan and media perspective is unfortunate. Ohio State gets to go out to Oregon at least, so I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, you'd want at least one of those games. You get to go see something new, right? That's unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, it's at Washington this year, so
okay.
I'm excited for that.
Yes.
I was Michigan was supposed to play them in 2020 in a non-conference game.
Yeah.
I think that series just ended up, or at least the return game probably got scrapped, right? Because Michigan did host Washington in 21. So I'm excited to sailgate.
Yeah. That's funny because Ohio State plays Oregon, and it was the same situation. Ohio State was supposed to go to Oregon in 2020, didn't go. Oregon came to Columbus in 2021. So, yes, excited to go see Eugene this year. Last thing about this team, and Young also asked about it, but I wanted to bring this up, and you've touched on the offensive line. I think that's probably a big part of this, but Donovan Edwards. Through 2 games, Michigan doesn't have a rushing touchdown. They've clearly made that a staple of their play the last few years. When you look at Donovan Edwards, look at this running game in general, what do you see? What needs to happen to get this going?
Yeah, I mean, it's multifaceted, as mentioned. Like it starts with the offensive line, but at the same time, like I think Michigan fans have realized at least is that Donovan Edwards as a between the tackles runner isn't necessarily, he's not Blake Corum, and he's not necessarily elite in that regard. That doesn't mean he's not a dynamic playmaker, because he absolutely is. I think that Michigan is in some ways not utilizing him appropriately, maybe in a lot of ways, honestly, because if you look at the Texas and Fresno State games, someone who started at wide receiver against Texas was Kendrick Bell, who was the aforementioned quarterback recruit in last year's class, and transitioned from quarterback to wide receiver. And he's the younger brother of Ronnie Bell. He's a very athletic player. He's someone who could certainly contribute maybe this year or down the line. But why is he starting, or why is Peyton O'Leary, a former walk-on, starting at wide receiver? CJ Charleston, who is a Youngstown State transfer. Like, these guys are all getting meaningful reps at receiver for Michigan when you have a guy like Donovan Edwards, who has shown throughout his career that he can split out wide. He can run routes like a wide receiver. He can be the guy doing end arounds. And Michigan hasn't really leaned into that this year. Michigan has a very, I'd say, good above average between the tackles backup running back and Kalel Mullins, who seems to be, he's more physical. He's a bigger body. He's a lot like Hassan Haskins maybe a couple of years ago, who Ohio State fans remember. And he saw, I think, 13 snaps against Texas and did very well with those 13 snaps, but he's seeing a limited role. And you're using Donovan Edwards in a way that maybe doesn't maximize his ability. So again, that's where I'd say the concern for Michigan fans isn't so much that, hey, Michigan lost to Texas, or hey, Michigan might not, four-peat as Big Ten champions this year, or they might not compete for national champion. Like, that's fine. Like, whatever. I think the bigger concern is, okay, we have a new coaching staff, and given the options that are on the roster, they're not using them in the best possible manner, right? And so what does that mean down the road? If you're not maximizing your Donovan Edwards, what's that mean in 25 or 26 when there's other players, but maybe not being used in the way that would create winning football?
Makes sense. I have to ask you, did you watch the Connor Stalions documentary on Netflix? And if so, what did you make of it?
I did. I've been trying not to tell people this, but actually I am Brohio. No, I thought it was entertaining. I think we've seen this with a lot of the Netflix documentaries, is that they're more, I think, entertainment than documentary. In particular with, like with the Johnny Manziel one, with this one too, like the unfortunate need to, I think they made it too soon. Like this situation, the NCAA investigation, like it's all still ongoing.
Sure.
Which makes it then very difficult for there to be an objective, or really like in-depth documentary about something, right? Because Connor Stalions is still being looked in, like he's still being investigated by the NCAA. He still wants to protect the University of Michigan because presumably he adores the University of Michigan. So like when you have those aspects, it creates for a less compelling documentary, because you're not going to get all the facts, and you're not going to get people who are willing to speak candidly about something, because there are still very real repercussions that come from what you say or don't say. Right. And I enjoyed the documentary. I thought Connor Stalions probably did himself a disservice by denying that he was on the sidelines in East Lansing. And yeah, Well, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed getting a look at the NCAA. I thought Brohio was ridiculous but humorous, and I wish that the documentary had come out like in 2 or 3 years, where we'd get at least the opportunity for a clearer picture, and more candid discussions from both sides.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about, I forget what they call those Netflix documentaries, but like the Johnny Manziel one, the Florida one.
Yeah.
I think those are the only 3 that I've watched all the way through.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like all of them, and we'll see what happens with the Connor Stalions stuff, but at least in the case of Johnny Manziel and Urban Meyer's Florida teams, like it left a lot out. They just like didn't address, some of the stuff that was happening at Florida, some of the stuff Johnny Manziel did. And I honestly felt like, and maybe you did with this because you were so involved in it, like the Johnny Manziel stuff, especially once he left and came to Cleveland, like being so close to Cleveland and having so many friends that are Browns fans. Like I knew most of that. It was very surface level things. Like, yeah, he parties. He doesn't read the playbook. Like we all knew that in Columbus, Ohio.
Right.
I assume it was probably similar in Ann Arbor. Like, yeah, we've been through this. We've heard all this already. Like I honestly thought one of the most interesting things was Connor Stalions explaining like how he studied signs. And like, now I want to know more about the sign, like the legal signs, legal sign stealing world.
Sure.
Like that was really what was most interesting to me out of it. So I agree with you 100%. I think it could have waited, but I'm sure Netflix got their money out of it because I imagine a lot of people watched it because it's hot right now.
Yeah, and Connor Stalions did too. So
yeah, sure.
And that's maybe part of the problem with all of these, right? Is that I imagine like that they're not saying like they're never going to say, oh, we paid so and so, but at the same time, when they're not saying we didn't pay them, that kind of tells you everything you need to know. Is that I'm sure Netflix paid Connor Stalions. I'm sure they paid Johnny Manziel. Like they're paying these people to create these, which. We don't need to discuss journalism ethics on this Buckeyes Happy Hour, but it creates a product that's different, maybe than what people would want it to be.
Sure. All right, Alejandro. Well, I've kept you longer than I expected, so I appreciate you being generous with your time. We have an off weekend. I know you have a game to cover tomorrow, so thank you for taking time this Friday afternoon. I appreciate it, and best of luck in your coverage the rest of the season. I'm sure we'll talk down the road.
Thank you very much. I hope we do. And happy birthday to whoever it is. Enjoy your natty light.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, man. Sure. All right. Thanks, Alejandro. Again, whether you are a Michigan fan or not, and I imagine most of you on this, listening to this, watching this, whatever it may be, are not, Alejandro does good work over at our Michigan site at 24/7 Sports. So if you're ever looking for Michigan stuff, I recommend looking his way. Okay. We're going to pivot back to Ohio State. First, I want to talk about what the Buckeyes are doing this week. I'm sure most of you have heard already, but I want to dive into kind of some thoughts on that. And then we'll talk about some games this weekend. It's not the greatest weekend to have no Ohio State game, but I do think there are some interesting games out there that I want to point out. And then again, if you have any questions, I haven't seen a ton of them in the chat here. But if you do have any questions on the Buckeyes, on college football, anything like that, we can get to some of those at the end. So feel free, if you're watching this live, to throw those in the chat now. So anyway, Ohio State, off weekend, bye weekend. People call it different things. Open weekend. Ohio State is calling this improvement week. And you can read about this. I wrote about it early in the week on Bucknuts. But basically, the Buckeyes didn't view this as an off week as they normally would. Instead, they practiced Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. That's the normal schedule. They have Mondays off, come back after games on Sundays, watch the film. Some of the guys who didn't practice as much, get some work done on the field, or didn't play as much, I'm sorry, get some work done on the field. So they kept basically that schedule. They didn't do the walkthrough on Friday. Instead, they let the guys go. But Ryan Day said on his radio show this week that this wasn't a weekend where guys are going to be, flying across the country to go home as much as they would. And they're viewing kind of their off week, bye week, open week, whatever, as the week after the Oregon game. And this is a week where they felt like they couldn't fall behind other teams that were playing because those teams are continuing to get better. So Ohio State, yes, 2-0, have done some really good things, but feel like they can't miss an opportunity to continue to improve. So I think this is a really good idea from Ryan Day. And when I was looking at the schedule, when it first came out, like I wondered what the Buckeyes would do having, you're not really beat up. It'd be one thing if they'd played like Michigan. If they'd played at Texas last week, okay, you're a bit more beat up. You have some chance to regroup, win or lose from that game. But you've played Akron and Western Michigan. You've more or less handled your business effectively in both those games. So guys got out of the game early. So there's not a lot of recovery time. Now, as I think it was Cody Simon said to us after the game, you'll take any time you can to have a week off, have some recovery. But ideally, I think what you would have wanted is like 4 games off week, 4 games off week, final 4 games. That would, I think any team would take that, but something closer to that, as opposed to 2 games, you're off, and then you play again for a month, and then you're off, and then you have a month and a half, and then you're, maybe off for almost a month if you make it straight through to the quarterfinals. So a bit of a weird scheduling quirk, and one of the weird years where they have 2 off by whatever weekends, which are great for people like me because I get extra weekend to watch college football. But I think the Buckeyes would certainly rather be playing this week. So from everything I've heard, it sounds like it's been a good week over at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center. I know they really wanted to drill down on, as Jim Knowles kind of talked about, those things that maybe don't show up in games like Akron, games like Western Michigan. But if you turn on the film and you really examine it, you see a guy kind of out of place on a play. And maybe because he's more physically gifted or something, he's able to still go make the play. But if you're playing in Oregon, you're playing a Penn State, you're playing a Michigan, things like that, you got to be on your spot to make the play. And so those are the kind of things, fundamentals, those little things that can get you in trouble down the road, especially on defense. Offensively, similar things. Obviously, it's the other side of the ball you're hoping to dictate, but it's about really kind of drilling into what happened in these first 2 weeks and where can we continue to get better. And I think that's a really good approach for this Buckeye team to take. And I think the message has been received by these players. I don't think anyone on this roster believes they've accomplished things. You talk to some of these players, and it's almost like they struggled in those games. They know that they were happy to have the shutout last week, but Cody Simon immediately points to, we didn't have any turnovers this game. After having 3 turnovers in week 1, like that's a goal that they want every week. So how can they get better that way? Offensively, yes, the run game got better. Offensive line play got better. That was really good to see from week 1 to week 2. Okay, now what are those things that I was just talking about? What maybe you got away with against Western Michigan to have some of those better runs that can be improved upon or fixed because you'll need to be better in some of those bigger games once you reach Big Ten. Now, coming out of this bye week, which is another reason it's a little weird, is you have another non-conference game against another team that you should probably beat pretty badly. So we still won't get to see Ohio State at fully tested, I should say, at least until Iowa. And that's an Iowa team that, at least defensively, I think will make for a test for this offense. It's an interesting schedule. I think the Buckeyes are handling it well. I do think continuing to drill down on these little things is not only going to be important for guys, key contributors, but the young guys who, maybe aren't getting in the game as much or getting in the game late. But that's a good message to have, not only this year, but next year, the year after, the year, whatever it may be, that, you can never buy into the hype of this team. And I think there are some teams around the country that maybe have a little bit. I'm looking specifically at Oregon, and that's a team that, at least from what I've seen of them, and I watched all of their game from last week, I know they're a little banged up on the offensive line. That certainly plays a part, but I do wonder if this team got a little ahead of itself in terms of what they thought they would be this year. And not to say that they still can't, but it's 2 narrow wins against teams. Probably, Boise State's a solid team, but you're playing at home. It was the first time Oregon had ever beaten Boise State, but it's just you can't get caught up in that stuff. And I think the fact that that message is being delivered by coaches and veterans now will help Ohio State in years to come, which I think will be good. All right, let's look at this week's schedule and some games that I think will be interesting, some games I will certainly be keeping an eye on throughout the week. The big one, obviously, is Alabama at Wisconsin. That game is at noon on, I believe it's the big noon game on Fox. That is the biggest game, I think, of the week, at least on paper. So obviously, Wisconsin has a chance to do a big favor for the Big Ten by knocking off Alabama at home. Alabama, after kind of struggling last week, they did end up pulling away against South Florida, but it was I think a 5-point game in the fourth quarter. You expect Alabama, just based on how things have gone in the past, to come in Madison and roll. But this isn't Nick Saban's Alabama team, and they haven't shown that same level of dominance yet. So I will be interested to see what they can do. Wisconsin's offense is still kind of a mess as they transition from the long time, ground and pound, big offensive linemen, multiple tight ends, Badger football, to what Luke Fickell and Phil Longo want, with more of the spread and throwing it all over the place. And that's going to take some time. We saw some success last year, but it's going to take a little bit more time. Another one that I think people will probably tune into, maybe even more than they have in the past, Oregon State, at least in this part of the country, Oregon State. As I mentioned, Oregon's a team that hasn't looked great the first couple weeks. Now you go on the road to your biggest rival in a game against two of the country's best rushers. Can they slow down that Oregon State rushing attack? Can they get the offense going with Dylan Gabriel? I think Ohio State fans in particular are going to be interested in keeping an eye on Oregon until that game in just under a month. So for me, that's an interesting one to watch. That game, I believe, is the 3:30. Yeah, 3:30 on Fox. So right after, you could just roll straight from Wisconsin, Alabama to Oregon State. How nice of that. Washington State also at least a little interesting. Now that Washington's in the Big Ten, Washington's 2-0, 2 wins against teams they should have beaten, which is good. Washington State also 2-0, same thing. We don't know a ton about these teams, but from a Big Ten perspective, trying to get the grasp on Washington and Oregon in the Big Ten. I've been trying to watch them as much as possible. Boston College, Missouri, going back to the noon slate, I think is interesting, just because I think Boston College has, you saw, I assume, them, the Eagles defeat Florida State 28-13, got a big win, again, against a team, Duquesne, that they should have beaten last week. So now you've got number 6 Missouri on the schedule, going to Missouri. Can former Ohio State offensive coordinator Bill O'Brien, can we call him that? Can he pull the upset? That's a 12:45 kickoff on the SEC network. So maybe you flip over to that one while the Wisconsin-Alabama game is on commercials. Notre Dame, Purdue. Notre Dame bouncing back from the surprising loss to Northern Illinois last week. Now you go to Purdue. And this is a Purdue team, 1-0, only one win against Indiana State. So, 49-0. But I think this will say something, regardless of how good Purdue is. It'll say something about what Notre Dame is. Can you put that upset loss behind you, go out to Purdue and take care of business against a team that you are definitely better than? Or are you going to allow this to linger? Maybe you win this game, but it's closer than you want. Maybe you lose this game. Things can get out of control in South Bend really quickly. The opportunity is still there for college football playoff. It's only one loss. I know they don't have a great schedule. You got USC at the end, but you can't lose another one like this. And I think you have to look convincing if you're Notre Dame. So I will at least be keeping an eye on that one. I don't know if I'll watch the whole thing. The night slate, not great. I know a lot of people, TCU and UCF, I'm not as interested in that one. I think Indiana, UCLA, it's UCLA's first, I think it's their first home game of the season. Yes, UCLA was off last week after playing Hawaii. So Indiana comes to town. Two teams that I don't think are going to be very good in the Big Ten, but two first-year head coaches. I think this is an important game for both programs because it's winnable on either side. Obviously, Indiana making the trek across the country a little bit more difficult, but if you're UCLA, you want to start off your time in the Big Ten 1-0. You should be able to beat Indiana at home, I think, but it won't be easy. It was a 16-13 win for UCLA against Hawaii in week 1. So, just from a pure Big Ten perspective, I'll keep an eye on that. And then the last one is tonight. We're recording this on Friday afternoon. Arizona against Kansas State. I think I saw right before we jumped on here, Arizona might be missing a guy or two. That game is at 8 p.m. on Fox. So, two ranked teams. There's not a lot. That may be the only ranked versus ranked matchup of the week. I think it is. So, if you don't have anything to do with your Friday night, that may be a place to go. All right, let's see. I think I saw a few questions come in here. We won't spend a ton of time on that. Oh, I brought this up while Alejandro was on. Young asked, any chance? Oh, no, that was about tequila. I am not drinking straight tequila today. I am drinking natural light. I explained that off the top if you missed it. But Young did ask about, there it is. What is up with Donovan Edwards? He looks like a completely different player than 2 years ago. Here is my thought. I just wanted to give my thought on Donovan Edwards. And obviously, Alejandro covers him on a daily basis, so he has more insight. Now, keep in mind, Donovan Edwards has spent, until this season, the vast majority now of his career as a backup. But he has been very up and down throughout his career. If you go and look at his game log, which I just pulled up here, there have been the big games against Ohio State, right? In, 216 yards and 2 touchdowns. Obviously had quite a few big plays in that game. Then he went and Purdue in the Big Ten championship game, 185 yards and a touchdown, 119 yards against TCU in the loss in the college football playoff semifinal. He had, let's see, what were the other big ones? Against Penn State, 173 yards, 2 touchdowns, also in 22. And then you look last year, obviously the national championship game, 104 yards and 2 touchdowns against Washington. But if you look at the rest of his career, now granted, some of that is the opportunity because Blake Corum has been there, but there's not a ton of production to say this is a guy who can be your lead back and we're confident in it. Now, obviously, this is true about a lot of backups who become starters, but I think he's got this boom bust potential, and he's happened to boom in a lot of big games when people are watching. Now, Donovan Edwards was a highly recruited kid. Ohio State was recruiting him. He's the same class, Trayvon Henderson. So the talent is there, but the production has never been there. And again, some of that has to do with Blake Corum, but I think people have somewhat overrated a player based on what he's done. Not to say he can't figure it out and do better, but just assuming he comes in and is the starter when he has a lot of games with 9 carries for 20 yards and a touchdown, 10 carries for 39 yards, 10 carries for 31 yards. So there's been a lot of that in his career as well as some of the big games. All right, let's see if we have any Ohio State or other college football questions. Robert McIntosh asks, any recommendation on next Saturday for the game? I will be attending. Are you talking before the game? If you're talking before the game, I haven't, and people can comment in the chat for you there. I have not been on campus to enjoy an Ohio State football game in quite some time, and campus has obviously changed. I will say it is the last weekend, I believe, of the Beer Stube on South Campus. So if that's something you want to, I bet it'd be a madhouse there. But if that's something you're into, there's not a ton of the bars as I hold up my outer end mug. And that place is always near and dear to my heart. Not a ton of the places I used to go. I know there's still a bunch of stuff on Lane. I would just walk around, see what happens. Maybe get invited into to a house party. Robert McIntosh also asked, thoughts on replacing Justin Fry? I think we need someone who can recruit the best of the best. I've weighed in on this a little bit, and I'm probably not the best person to ask from a recruiting perspective, though I have said on this show before and elsewhere that I do think offensive line is the hardest position to recruit, to evaluate, because I think to translate, there's a lot of development that typically goes on from a high school offensive lineman to being ready to play college. And so I have continued to sort of be wait and see. And this is a big year for Justin Fry in terms of developing guys, like say the Armstrong twins, obviously very young in their career right now. Say they go on to be significantly better than their recruiting rankings, which they were good, not great as recruits. That's a credit to Justin Fry, assuming he stays around, right? That he found these guys, developed them, so on and so forth. Now, in terms of the recruiting, yeah, I mean, you'd love to hit on these 5-star offensive linemen. I think it's certainly a negative for Justin Fry in terms of retaining him that he hasn't been able to land those guys, especially the out-of-state guys, at the level expected. I will say we're in a different era in terms of the transfer portal. And, there are guys that could be available that Ohio State recruited. And I think if you're an Ohio State fan, you're probably hoping things continue to go south for Deion Sanders in Colorado, because there's an offensive tackle out there that, I don't know how he's enjoying his time in Boulder or what, but if Jordan Seaton entered the transfer portal, I imagine Ohio State would be very interested, as they were during recruiting. So I think there's a lot that goes into deciding whether to move on from Justin Fry. The recruiting aspect is a big part, no doubt, but only a part. If he can develop guys, and, we'll see, but I thought there was development made last year. I thought week 1 to week 2 this year was good in terms of offensive line play. I think Josh Simmons is a much better player than he was when he arrived at Ohio State. I think you've seen Tegra Shabola go from a guy who looks the part but doesn't play like it to being what appears to be a pretty good starting guard and maybe a starting tackle next season. We'll see what Josh Fryer looks like as the season goes on. Austin Saraveld's played all right so far through 2 games, having to step in for Donovan Jackson. So if Justin Fry can hit on that development part, then that's a big piece of it as well. And, I'm not trying to defend Justin Fry. I just think there's a lot that goes into that type of question. Rick Montoya asked, any injury updates, if any? We haven't heard anything. I do, obviously, as I said, they did practice, and I think there were some pretty, real live practices. But I have not heard anything about any sort of injuries, if anything happened. I want to acknowledge this one. Yasharel asked about the offensive line and how they will look when Donnie gets back. Do you like the amount of rotating on defense? So first thing, I sort of addressed this already with the offensive line. I think it was improvement from week 1 to week 2, but I think it's hard to evaluate that based on the opponent. I think if you'd seen more of the same against Western Michigan that you did against Akron, and I think some of what happened against Akron was you insert a guy who you didn't expect to start at all in Austin Saraveld in. You have a new starting center who, yes, started Alabama, but new to Ohio State, and Tegra Shabola, new first-time starter. And remember, Austin Saraveld never even played in a college game before. He didn't play as a freshman. So if you think about that, each guy is playing next to somebody that they've never played in a game with before. And I think that showed. And I thought it got better as the game went on, and I needed to see significant improvement from week 1 to week 2. We saw that. Now I think you put Donovan Jackson back in there. Yes, obviously he will have to kind of gel with Seth McLaughlin. He obviously has a relationship with Josh Simmons, but I think you're moving in the right direction. And I'm not ready to say confidently because it's 1 week to another. You have to go out against Marshall and dominate up front again like they did against the Broncos. And then I will start to feel more confident. And obviously Iowa will be a test for that offensive line. But I like the approach so far, or I like the development from week 1 to week 2, the improvement from week 1 to week 2. In terms of the rotating on defense, I think it's been good. I'm curious, and I asked Ryan Day about this week. Like, it's easy to rotate against Akron and Western Michigan, especially as you get up bigger, even before you take the starters out. It's easy to take out Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau and put in Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson, right? Because you know that those guys are good enough to still be able to cause problems. What do you do? Do you rotate as much against Iowa? Do you rotate as much against Oregon? They've talked a lot about depth. It'll be interesting to see if that continues, but I do like it. I think the standard can't drop though. And that's the big thing. If you're going to put Arvell Reese in the game, for instance, it's got to be the same as if Sonny Styles and Cody Simon are in there. I think CJ Hicks showed in week 1 that maybe that wasn't the case when he started for Cody Simon, and then nothing against CJ Hicks. I think he's got some skill sets that they can use, but then you saw week 2, Arvell Reese kind of take a jump in terms of his amount of playing time, especially early on. And I think that was reflective of what was seen on film. So I like the rotation. I will be interested to see how much it continues. I'd also like to see more rotation on the interior of the defensive line. That needs to be something that the players earn. It's not just going to be given. But I would like to see that more similar to what they do on the edges. Terry Slusher asked, what does Wisconsin have to do to beat Bama? Well, I think they need to get the offense going. Wisconsin scored 28 points against Central Michigan in week 1. Now, granted, new defensive coordinator, first time seeing it, all that. But Wisconsin right now is 87th in the country, averaging 27.5 points per game. And, it's not like Wisconsin's played a brutal schedule to start the season. It was Western Michigan and South Dakota. And against South Dakota, they scored 27 points. So I think it starts there is figuring out a way. Yeah, you're trying to work towards this different offense, and obviously you have to change personnel to do it, but figuring out a way to get something going. Alabama, despite having some struggles last week, 63-0 against Western Kentucky week 1, and then they ended up pulling away in the fourth quarter, 42-16 against South Florida. So, yeah, they had some struggles against South Florida, but they figured out a way to get some points on the board and end up winning by quite a bit, kind of like Ohio State week 1. So for me, it's about, obviously you're going to have to stop Alabama too, but more so I think getting the offense going and, trying to score with the Crimson Tide. Plus, that crowd, I know it's a noon game. It'll be 11 a.m. in Madison, but that crowd needs to be a factor. And not that these Alabama players will be surprised by a great crowd. They see it in the SEC, but need to be a part of it if you're going to win that game for sure. All right, we're going to wrap it up with this week's Bucknuts Happy Hour. Next week, we will be doing something a little different. You will hear about that as we get into next week, but stay tuned for Friday. I can say that we're going to basically combine the Bucknuts Happy Hour and the Morning 5. We're going to do this earlier in the day, but we'll do a longer than normal Bucknuts Morning 5 because we're going to have a pretty exciting guest on, it sounds like. So we'll tease that more we'll talk about that more. I just wanted to tease it a little bit. Stay tuned for infos on that. Enjoy your off weekend. We've got no headline this weekend because I didn't think about it because there's no game. So cheers, Buckeye fans. Have a good off weekend. Enjoy your college football, NFL football, whatever you're into this weekend. Maybe get outside, do some stuff you wouldn't be able to when there's a Buckeye game on. I'm going to try and do the same. Actually, I'm going to watch sports all weekend. Who am I kidding? I will talk to you guys all next weekend. Stay tuned for more information. Cheers.